Here with you on the line with us is our old friend, Professor Richard Wolff. DemocracyAtWork.info is his website. He is the co-founder of Democracy at Work, an economist, an author. His most recent book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff, P-R-O-F-W-O-L-F-F. Dr. Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
It is always great having you. I always learn from you. And I'm curious, Donald Trump has been going after the Fed. This is something that traditionally presidents don't do. Long after Lyndon Johnson died, we learned that I believe his Fed chief's name was Miller. And he had this guy into the White House, and he was concerned that interest rates were going up, and he didn't want that happening. Literally grabbed him by the shirt collar, slammed him up against the wall, lifted him off his, up on his tippy toes, and threatened him. And Miller still said, "Screw you," to LBJ, or words to that effect, and went ahead and raised interest rates. Trump seems to be trying to threaten the current Fed chief that he himself appointed. And I'm wondering what this means. Where can he go with this? What kind of damage can this do? Why does Trump even care? And how, in all probability, will the Fed respond? I mean, I noticed today, after this reporting went out last night about this, that today that foreign currencies are up, the dollar's down, gold is up. All things that would tend to indicate that they expect that the Fed is going to back down in the face of Trump, but maybe not. But what do you think about all this?
Well, it begins with trying to understand the problem the Fed has and why it is now beginning to raise interest rates, because at base, that's the issue. And the reason for that is simple. Starting in 2000, when the dot-com bubble burst, and then again in 2008, when the mortgage crisis took us over the edge, the response of the Federal Reserve in the United States, and indeed of central banks around the world, was not to get us out of this capitalist crash by helping the people at the bottom, for example, with a government employment program or a mass distribution of helping the poor, et cetera, but instead by what's called monetary policy. And the central component of monetary policy is to reduce interest rates to virtually zero, which was done. And indeed, in some cases, the interest rates went below zero.
And this is to flood the system with cheap money, right?
Exactly. To make it so cheap to borrow money that every bank would borrow from the government who prints it, and hopefully, that's what they hoped, businesses would borrow to expand and consumers would borrow to spend. So the whole thing was premised on flooding the economy with money and boosting it. The problem, of course, when you do that is that at some point, all of that extra money may come back and start to be nervous about holding, people who have it, nervous about holding money, because if prices start to go up, then the value of any money you hold correspondingly goes down. So the great fear of this way of dealing with capitalist instability by pumping money in will come back to haunt you by producing an inflation. The fear is that once that starts, it's very hard to control. Once people see prices rising, they will run to unload their money into something more secure, and that, of course, will make the problem worse. So what government central banks like the Fed have to do sooner or later is try to bring that money back out of the economy, raise interest rates. That's how you do that, because that means banks won't borrow from the government and businesses won't borrow from banks, and the whole money creation machine goes into reverse as a way to do that, to prevent the inflation from getting underway that becomes so hard to control. That's what the Federal Reserve decided over the last year and a half to do. Slowly, modestly raise interest rates so as to keep this monster of inflation, that's a serious problem given how much money has been pumped into the economy, not just by the United States, but by central banks in Europe, by the Japanese, and so on. And so that's what the Fed was doing. before he appointed Mr. Powell, that is, President Trump appointed Powell, and since he appointed him, because there's a pretty strong consensus on doing this. The only disagreements in the Fed are how big the upward movement should be, how fast it should occur, things like that. For the president to step in is simple politics. When you raise interest rates, you slow down the economy. That's what the whole point of it is. And he doesn't want the economy to be slowed down before the November elections. There's nothing there that's mysterious. There's nothing there that anyone has to puzzle over. This is a direct intervention by the president, loudly, as he does everything, in order to push the political risk of losing the House or the Senate to a lower level than it might otherwise have if the Fed does what it's supposed to do. Mr. Trump's political short-term advantage is the Trump card, if you allow me, that he plays over and against what the Federal Reserve, Republicans and Democrats alike, understand it should be doing at this point.
But if I'm the chairman of the Fed, I'm looking at the Republican Party and Donald Trump flooding $1.5 trillion borrowed dollars into the economy. Granted, over $1 trillion of it has, about $1 trillion of it has been used for share buybacks, so it's mostly just fattening the wallet of the top 1% or less than the top 1%. But still, you know, $1.5 trillion. You know, I mean, I remember when Reagan did this, and you know, with his tax cuts, and jacked the U.S. deficit by almost $2 trillion, and that was back when a dollar was worth a hell of a lot more than it is now. And people would say, "Oh, Reagan's got the economy rolling," and my response was, "You give me a $2 trillion credit card, I can show you what, you know, living large looks like." So the chairman of the Fed has to be looking at this juicing of the economy and thinking, you know, this is like, you know, a guy who didn't get enough sleep who decides to deal with that not by taking a nap, but by drinking three quarts of coffee. I mean, he's put the economy on steroids. How does this end?
Well, it's even worse than that, because think of it as double steroids, because you have been pumping the economy up with more money, and then last December you gave businesses and rich people a stupefyingly large tax cut, which they are now spending and using to buy back shares, to boost their dividends, and so on. You've put the economy on a steroid shot, both in fiscal policy with the tax cut, and now with monetary policy, as you keep preventing the closing of the money chute going into the economy. But I'm just reminded of the famous remark of King Louis before the French Revolution, "Après moi, le déluge." That is, after me, let the storm come, but as long as I'm in here, I'm going to do anything and everything to keep hold of the power I have, and I'm not going to worry one bit about what happens a month literally afterwards, or let alone a year afterwards, and we're just seeing that being played out. And if Mr. Trump's appointees play true to form, my guess is they'll go along. They may not do no interest rates, but my guess is, and that's what you're seeing in the stock market response, the assumption is the increases will be smaller than they otherwise would have been. There'll be fewer. There'll be bigger spaces between them. They will kind of cut the difference, accommodate Mr. Trump to some degree, but not 100%, so it doesn't look like the Fed is simply caving in the face of it. And maybe that won't be enough for Mr. Trump, and he'll shuffle the Fed Reserve chairman as fast as he's shuffled his cabinet appointees.
There's a piece in the Financial Times today pointing out that the longest expansion since World War II, and it may be the longest expansion in the history of the United States, but they just take their stats back to World War II, was 113 months, if my memory serves me right. And tomorrow, on Wednesday, we hit 113 months on this expansion. So, you know, the end will come. I mean, this is the cyclical nature of capitalism. When that end comes, whether it's, you know, this week or whether it's, you know, a year from now, and you can make an argument for either one, I suppose, but particularly the year from now, because so much money has been poured into the economy. The way that the Fed typically responds to a downturn in the economy is by lowering interest rates, by flooding the zone with cheap cash, but they can't they can't do that if they don't raise them first. I mean, isn't the normal range of interest rates in the United States typically around 2.5% to 3.5%?
Yes, normally the whole logic of the money management is that you raise the rates when the economy is in good shape, so to speak, and doing reasonably well, so that you can lower it when the economy, as you say, predictably with its cycles goes down. If you don't raise it in the good time, you've got really no wiggle room when it comes to the bad time. And let me underscore your other point. It's precisely because businesses around the world, in the United States and beyond, are very aware of what you said, that we are already long in the tooth of this so-called recovery since 2009 that has left so many Americans out of the recovery. We're already so far into it that businesses are cutting back. There's no point in hiring workers now, expanding capacity to produce, if you're looking at a crash a month from now, a year from now, or 2 or 3 years from now. So they bring about the very thing they fear by holding back, but it's the only rational way for them to cope with the likely future that they have to guess about. That's one of the crazinesses of a capitalist system, that the way it makes for rational decision-making brings about the very thing that makes the system unstable in the first place.
Wow. So you're expecting more instability coming, and
absolutely. And in that, I am sharing a point of view that the financial press is increasingly circulating among people, including people who like Mr. Trump, but whose first loyalty is to the company and the investment program that their livelihoods depend on.
Yeah, remarkable. Professor Richard Wolff, democracyatwork.info is his website. His book, his most recent book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff, Profwolff. Do I have all that right, Professor?
You absolutely do, and thanks for going through it.
My pleasure. And thank you for being with us today. And I really appreciate the clear, cogent, understandable explanation of what's going on with the Fed here. It's good stuff. We'll be right back. It's